Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, so sorry, I just did an AP flip, an honors flip. I got confused for a minute. I didn't know who else I was going to actually say welcome back to, but welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back, everybody. Anyway, so big thing that we got to get into in this first flip of your Thanksgiving break is we're talking about the Reformation. Now, we are getting into a new unit now, so I need you to make me a brand new, fresh piece of paper. We're now getting into the Reformation period, right? Now, the Reformation period is a major, major event that occurs in European history that we are going to kind of do right after the Renaissance, and then we're going to talk about exploration separately. And we're going to do that just because I think exploration is mainly affecting a whole other part of the world. But in Europe, you saw the Renaissance happen and the Reformation come almost right after it, right? Now, interestingly enough, you got to understand that I know that you know some stuff about the Reformation already. But we are going to be now analyzing the Reformation from the political end of things, less from the Catholic Church perspective, right? And that does not mean that I'm going against things, and some of y'all are like, why are we letting a Protestant talk about the Reformation? Remember, I was raised Protestant, not much of a Protestant anymore. My wife is Catholic. She's good people. Now, look, but big thing, though, is you got to understand is that the Renaissance pretty much causes the Reformation, right? And the reason why the Renaissance causes the Reformation is because people are going to use that big Renaissance idea, right? Humanism, right? They're going to start using that idea of studying secular things to look at their lives and kind of begin to question that central force in their lives, which is the church, right? They're going to look at the church and they're going to be like, are they doing this right? All right, so and they're going to start asking a lot of questions, right? And what the Protestant Reformation is, so we can completely lay it out there, is it's going to be a movement in Europe that is going to split the Christian church in Western Europe and lead to the establishment of a number of new churches, right? And some of you are probably like, oh, so this is kind of like the schism. Yes, Katie Goodwin, T-Dog out, okay? Yes, I could pretty much end it here because you understand what I'm getting at, right? So the Great Schism is a lot like the Protestant Reformation, right? When the Great Schism created Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox in 1053, we're going to now see this happen again in the early 1500s, right? But this is going to be the Protestant Reformation. And y'all also talked about the leader of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, in your religion classes with the Mr. Mathern, who has done me such a huge favor doing this. But we're going to go into much more depth with it. And we're also going to talk about the English version of the Reformation with Henry VIII and all of his wives. And we're going to talk about the French version of the Reformation with the Calvinist Reformation, John Calvin and the Affair of the Placards, all these posters popping up everywhere, making everybody mad, especially the king. Now, big thing going forward, though, is you got to understand is that the church during the Middle Ages, right? During the Middle Ages, coming out of the Middle Ages and going into the 1500s, okay? Going into the 1500s. So this is like the stuff preceding. These are our causes of the Reformation, right? Jot that down. Causes of the Reformation, okay? So you got to understand is that the church was falling subject to financial corruption, abuse of power, immorality of popes, and the popes are getting caught up in very worldly affairs, right? Like competing with princes and kings for power, okay? So we're seeing a church that has become less about faith and is becoming much more about acting almost like a state, right? Acting almost like a country in and of itself. Now, interestingly enough, some of you are super smart and you're like, wait a minute, wasn't the church pretty much a state as it was? Yeah, it was. Like if we go over here real quick and we look at this map of Italy, which is very important. Remember we talked about this in the Renaissance era. Like the church basically owned its own country and it was known as the Papal States right here. And the leader of that state was the Pope, right? They taxed, they led wars, they created armies. Like it's a big thing to understand that some things had kind of gone sideways during the Middle Ages, and it led to this church that kind of acted up a lot more like a king and a kingdom, and a lot less like a church about saving souls and stuff. Now, big thing though going forward that you need to understand is, yes, I need to put a disclaimer out there, okay? There is nothing wrong with the faith itself. I'm not saying that the Catholic faith is wrong. I'm saying that the church during the late Middle Ages was led by some mean people. Was led by people that didn't have the idea of saving people's souls at their heart. It was led much more by politics and things like that. And this is something that Pope Francis himself has even apologized for, right? He has literally came out under his reign and said, things were messed up at certain times, and we apologize. It should have never happened, right? So just so you know that I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the Catholic faith. I'm just saying that there were some people that were doing some bad things, right? And so to name a few of those bad things, one of the biggest ones that you have to understand is that concept of papal supremacy that we talked about in the Middle Ages unit when a king or in popes were trying to claim power and authority over kings and other leaders and princes and things like that, right? So, it's seltzer, by the way. Calm down. Now, really quick thing, though. Bad popes are starting to act more like monarchs, right? And some people are like, well, you know, that seems pretty much because they were monarchs, right? They waged war, they taxed, they led lavish lives. Some of the best example, or the best example of a Renaissance era pope being kind of a huge jerk is Julius II, who reigned from 1503 to 1513. He literally was known as the warrior pope, right? He invaded Italy at least 3 separate times and bought his papal reign, right? He hated the guy that came before him, which is Alexander VI, right? And Alexander VI, that pope became before him, had an illegitimate child named Caesar Borgia, right? We're talking about a string of popes that were much more concerned with politics than they were concerned with the church, right? And it's not the church's fault. It's not the Catholic faith's fault that those guys were in charge. It's because there was a lot of sketchy stuff going on that y'all learned about in religion as well. Things like nepotism and also things like simony, which we'll talk about here in a second, okay? Now, Julius II is a great example of that. He ends up dying from syphilis in 1513, which is another whole thing, pot of worms or can of worms, not going to open right now. He actually at one point ends up invading several city-states, growing the papal states. And he kind of just acts a lot more like a jerk than a pope, right? So he even also bought his reign. Like he literally paid to be pope. He bribed a bunch of cardinals to be pope, right? And then also, this doesn't just happen in the 1500s. There's also some crazy stuff that was going on in the Middle Ages. There was this thing called the Cadaver Synod in 897, when Pope Stephen VI, who is right here, put Pope Formosus on trial. Pope Formosus had been dead for 7 months. All right, so that's right. The Pope in 897 in the Middle Ages put a dead Pope on trial, right? So, and he accused him of heresy, and he accused him of illegitimate faith, and he accused him of all these other things, and he pointed at him, and basically it was a big theater trial where he yelled at a dead body for several hours, right? And he had forced a young Italian deacon to sit behind the body and speak for it, right? So he'd be like, I'm sorry that I sinned. And he would just move the mouth or speak for it or whatever, and basically just agree to all the things that Stephen VI was accusing him of. Stephen VI then had the right hand of Pope Formosus, the middle finger, index finger, and thumb all cut off so he couldn't bless anything in the afterlife. And then he had his body buried in the graveyard for vagrants and foreigners outside of Rome. And then after he was buried for another week, he was like, no, that's not enough. And he had them re-dig up the body and then huck it in the Tiber River. This guy was it's a very intense thing. This is a big thing to show you that the Pope and the papal reign in the Middle Ages have become much more about politics and authority. And ironically enough, Pope Stephen, the guy who accused Pope Formosus of being a jerk, it turns out that the poor people loved Pope Formosus, and then they kind of led a raid and a big mob grabbed Stephen and threw him out of office, which is kind of funny and crazy. Now, Inquisition, right? Another big reason why we could say that there was examples of church corruption was Inquisition, torture, and execution, right? I know a big thing is you got to understand, historically speaking, and I'm saying this just to make sure you understand, the Inquisition was a little a little embellished, right? That's the word I'm looking for. Exaggerated, okay? So a lot of times you'll hear from other history teachers be like, oh, well, the Inquisition executed and tortured millions of people. That's not necessarily true. And then people like to look at it a lot of times oh, this is a church court that was centrally ran by the Pope who was going after all these people. It actually is more like ecclesiastical juries, and it was in certain cities and villages. It wasn't regulated by the Pope. But the problem was when Rome fell, there was no court system left. So people turned to their village churches and to their deacons and their bishops to solve issues within the community. Let's say, hypothetically, my wife was accused of being a witch. Are you a witch?
Yes.
She is a witch, she says. She cast a spell on me, that's for sure. Aww. Oh, come on, that was cute.
That was all right.
I love you.
I love you too.
Oh, she's so sweet. All right, but the Inquisition would be held to find out if she was actually a witch or not. And in some circumstances, torture was used to elicit confessions, right? And also, there was a pope literally Pope Pius III said, like, anybody who takes the name of God negatively should be burned without guilt. Like, so we're talking about some issues, right? Like, again, Pope Francis has come out and apologized for the Inquisition, right? Now, it's not as widespread as people think. The Spanish Inquisition is a great example. That was actually led by monarchs. It wasn't actually led by the Pope itself, but people were even taking the Catholic Church's name and trying to attach it to monarchical and political things, right? So there's a lot of negative things. And just so you know, there's another very famous example of a person being burned at the stake. That was oftentimes what happened to people who would be executed by the church. Joan of Arc was held by an inquisition and condemned of heresy and like wrongful faith and then burned at the stake, right? She's a famous person that we talked about that was basically executed by the church, right? So, and also it was much more political. She was much more executed by the English. But the fact of the matter is that politics and countries are pulling the faith down on their side. This is going to lead to people having a bad taste in their mouth, right? They're going to say, well, why didn't the Catholic Church stop that, right? There were popes that curbed the Inquisition and said, y'all need to calm down in some of these villages. We shouldn't be using this that often, right? This is to be not... Well, and then there's another problem that happened too. From 1378 to 1417, when Dante was like alive, all right? So when Petrarch was alive, when some of these Renaissance humanists were alive, there were multiple popes, all right? So the Great Western Schism, and I know Bella and Ariana Truelove are like, oh, I did my poster on this. You did, and y'all did a great job, right? So the Great Western Schism, also known as the Avignon Papacy, was, I kid you not, when there were multiple popes, all right? So it's a very long, convoluted story. But what ended up happening is one pope was elected after another pope had died, and then he said a lot of stuff that the cardinals were like, okay, just kidding, we don't like him. Let's like this other guy who's French, and that French pope lived in France, and so there were two popes at once because one refused to give up the power, and the other one said he was the pope. So you had like the pope and the anti-pope, and what happened is at one point there were four at most, and then look at this right here. Literally the Great Western Schism is, see the different colors of the countries? They started picking popes. Well, Kingdom of Hungary is like, well, I like the other pope. And then Northern Italy was like, well, I do like that pope also. And then people were like, oh, I like this pope. And blah, 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 blah. Like, you have this huge issue going on where countries then begin to pick popes because there were three of them at once, right? And at one point there were four, which is wild, right? And so just so you understand, this is also going on and going to influence Renaissance thinkers. This right here is an engraving. That's Dante. Look at Dante. He's in the Inferno, and he's looking at priests who have been buried upside down in hell in cauldrons with only their feet exposed, right? So, because demons would then come up and poke it with hot skewers. Here's Virgil standing right next to him, and Dante's like, oh no. That's because people were very aware of what simony was. In that engraving right here, Dante is looking at people being punished for simony, right? So simony, that buying and selling of church offices, right? So Dante even wrote this into his early Renaissance works. So it bears to mention that Catholics themselves were like, things are a little screwed up, right? So Dante was making fun of some popes. He literally, at that moment, when he's talking to those feet, that's one of the popes that had came before the current pope at the time. Nepotism was a huge issue, right? Famous families being elected to high ecclesiastical offices due to the fact that their family was the Sforzas or the Medici or the whatever, right? So now, you've got also another big one, pluralism. Put the star next to that one, okay? That's one thing y'all didn't talk about in religion. Pluralism was people holding multiple church offices at once and getting paid for all of them, right? So you would have somebody like let's say, hypothetically, Mr. Wooderson, right? Mr. Wooderson was just a parish priest at first, and then somebody asked him, they're like, oh, hey, Kyle, you know what else you should do? You should totally be the bishop for this area. And he's like, oh, okay, but I want to get paid for my parish priest stuff too. They're like, oh, okay, that's fine. So he's getting paid multiple salaries at once because he's holding multiple church offices all at the same time, right? So, and then you would actually be elected to all these other, and there's a lot of other reasons too. The issues of language, right? The issues of language were a big deal. Again, disclaimer, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the Catholic faith. I'm just saying things got a little corrupt in the back end of it, right? In the 1300s, there were some problems, right? So that people were like, ew. Like even Dante saw him, right? And Dante died a devout Catholic, right? A lot of these people died devout Catholics. They didn't ever break away from the church. They were like, we understand things are wrong, but we're not going to stop being Catholic, right? So the Reformation just kind of flipped everything on its head because everything got out of control, right? Most of these thinkers never intended to stop being faithful, all right? So like they intended to continue to be Catholics, right? Now, there were a lot of early reformers too. Very early reformers. Guys that showed up before Martin Luther and tried to reform the church. One of the most famous is this guy, and his name is Desiderius Erasmus, right? And he's Flemish, but he's from one of the northern countries. He's not Italian, all right? And Desiderius Erasmus is the guy that is considered the father of Christian humanism, right? Desiderius Erasmus, who again died a devout Catholic. No one was saying anything was wrong with Catholicism. They were only saying the leadership and power was sketchy, right? So that's what they were getting at, okay? A lot of these reformers were like, hey, you shouldn't do that, Julius II. You're being a huge jerk. Stop invading other places like you're a king or some kind of tyrant. And then he'd be like, and then like he just wouldn't listen, right? So guys like this guy, Desiderius Erasmus, who is considered the father of Christian humanism, which is when Christianity, like Christian humanists begin to look at Christianity like this should be a guide to our lives, not a checklist to get into heaven, begins to translate the Bible into Greek, which was a very bold move. That's the other big thing, vernacular literature, right? Because the Bible was only written in Latin, so nobody could read it. So big thing is he became a big proponent of exposing church corruption, right? Desiderius Erasmus writes a very famous work known as The Praise of Folly, which basically starts to expose church corruption, starts pointing out simony, starts pointing out pluralism, starts pointing out a lot of these issues, and it becomes printed and it gets shotgunned all over Europe, right? And so his ideas begin to spread. Guess who read this thing? Martin Luther read this thing, right? So like The Praise of Folly becomes a very popular work that was printed and distributed all over Europe, right? In the late 1400s, early 1500s, right? And just early 1500s. In that book, Desiderius Erasmus said that Julius II will not get into heaven. That's right. Desiderius Erasmus said that Julius II, the Pope at the time, will have to stand out front of the gates with a list of all of his sins to be accounted for. That's a bold move, right? Like, so Martin Luther wasn't the first guy, right? Like, he wasn't the first one. Dante made fun of the church. Erasmus made fun of the church. And two other guys we're going to like bring up in a second are also very important. But remember, he never left the Catholic faith. Desiderius Erasmus died a devout Catholic, right? So now also, John Wycliffe was another big one who died a devout Catholic. Oh, geez. Like, so that got really big and weird. All right, so now John Wycliffe, English priest, right, who was very, very Catholic, died a devout Catholic, believed that the church had gotten too wealthy. And he said that the church should give up all of its earthly possessions, right? His writings weren't discovered until after his death, right? And after he had died and received a Catholic burial, he was excommunicated at the Council of Constance, which we'll talk about here in a second, and his body was then dug up, burned, and buried and thrown out in the woods, right? Like, so just because he said maybe the material wealth of the church has grown too big and they're focusing more on gaining money instead of saving souls, right? And that's a big thing. His body was dug up and burned out of spite, right? So now the big one, though, is this guy, Jan Hus, right? Also pronounced sometimes as Jan Hus, right? Jan Hus is Bohemian, just to give you a heads up, all right? So just so you understand who this guy is, he is going to exist during the era of like Dante. It's early 1400s, so is John Wycliffe. Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, make a note somewhere, they came before Desiderius Erasmus. They existed before he was alive, okay? Jan Hus was a Bohemian priest. He's Czech. Bohemia means Czech, or like Czech Republic, right? It's next door to Germany and north of Austria, right? So he is the first big reformer. He is a priest that speaks out against the immorality of the church. He advocates for receiving bread and wine at Mass, for priests to be allowed to get married, the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages, which he did. He translated it into Czech after being told not to, right? Abolishing the idea of purgatory, eliminating the concept of simony, ending any future crusades, right? Very, very big, very, very bold move. He translates the Bible into Czech, and all of his followers become known as Hussites. So technically, Jan Hus is the first Protestant, all right? So because Jan Hus, his followers started a new church. They were called the Hussite Church, right? Named after Jan Hus himself. Then he would be summoned to this thing known as the Council of Constance in 1415. At the Council of Constance, that's where they agreed to dig up John Wycliffe and burn his remains. And at the Council of Constance in 1415, he was told when he was coming, nothing bad will happen to you. We promise we just want to hear what you have to say. Jan Hus was then put in front of an inquisition for heresy, and he was burned at the stake for his crimes against the church. Jan Hus, the first Protestant reformer, was then burned at the stake for heresy, right, due to the Inquisition. So, as you can see, there were some issues in the Catholic Church, right? There was some political corruption, but there was nothing wrong with the faith, okay? Nothing wrong with the faith. The Catholic faith was fine. The people running it were just being pretty immoral, right? So, now, with that, in the next flip, we're going to start talking all about, where is he? This guy. We're going to talk about Martin Luther in the next flip a little bit more aggressively, a little bit more intensely, and a little bit more historically, right? And then when we come back from break, we're going to talk about Henry VIII, which is so much fun. But I'll see you guys then. Y'all have a great one. I'll upload and post your next flip tomorrow, okay? See y'all later.